Yeah,
You
yeah,
can hit
that's fine.
the record button, Yusra, and we can go.
Yeah.
Excellent. If you have a presentation, Claudia, by all means.
Yeah. No, apologies. I don't have a presentation.
No, no apologies
Yeah,
needed.
and the paper is a little bit rougher than I would have liked. I've actually been really quite ill after having the COVID vaccine, so yeah, apologies for that.
Well, I hope you're
Just,
feeling better. No worries about that.
yeah, slowly. So yeah. Anyway, yeah, so I'm going to be talking about bureaucracy. In the title, it's got boredom in the title. I'm not actually going to talk about boredom, although that is an aspect of bureaucracy, maybe for another paper. Going to talk about bureaucracy in the light of activist organising and the possibility of rethinking it in the light of recent scholarship on the subject. My own position is of a very precarious researcher, and one of the multiple identities that I inhabit as a sort of, activist, academic, etc., is as a facilitator and consultant for alternative and horizontally structured organisations. So in that sense, I'm not taking a sort of purely neutral stance in the paper. So one organisation I've been working with has a set of core values which includes being staunchly anti-bureaucratic. And this has actually created tensions with some of their other values. And that's what prompted me to look at this a bit further. So it's not a case study of that particular organisation, but I'm going to just explore bureaucracy on the level of discourse. The anthropologist David Graeber argued that during the long 1960s, bureaucracy became a principal unity against which social movements rebelled. Bureaucracy symbolised the monolithic state, the monolithic nature of state infrastructure in particular, soul-destroying conformity and grey functionalism that characterised modern capitalism. It became the system as a symbol for the left of centralised oppression and arbitrary power that dehumanised and stifled individual autonomy and creativity. And in response, social movements have pitted individual expression and spontaneous conviviality against bureaucratic social control. However, as Graeber also argued, the language of anti-bureaucratic individualism has since been adopted by the right. Bureaucracy is used as byword for unelected officialdom, faceless bureaucrats and red tape against which to cut. But while neoliberal advocates, they've used anti-bureaucratic rhetoric to promise to free people from the authority, from the kind of bureaucratic welfare state, but new mechanisms of surveillance and supervision have also been proliferating and are becoming, more automated and also arguably more decentralized as well. So it seems really important to unpick bureaucracy from a number of perspectives. As a counterpoint, Paul de Gay argues that due to this rise in right-wing populism and its aggressive attack on the state, it might actually be time to rethink or even drop a preference among some CMS scholars for flat horizontal movements and community-based organisations. And he specifically gives examples of co-ops and commons-based organisations as epitomising anti-bureaucratic modes of organisation. And he points to the similarity between leftist critiques and right-wing populist ones. And instead, de Gay argues that bureaucracy actually provides an ethical framework that works against arbitrary power and discrimination. And he's recently re-emphasised how the State Bureau is suited to providing routine needs of a larger society, and he's re-emphasised this in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. Although actually you can also make the other argument, maybe that's something we can talk about later. So as I say, it seems important to kind of unpick things and problematize anti-bureaucratic assumptions. But, perhaps it's not as simple as giving up on horizontally based organisations. So I'm going to try and look at bureaucracy briefly on the level of the technical, the ethical and the imaginary, and look at the discourse on bureaucracy in relation to particularly commons and co-op based organisations. And what this raises is questions of policy and policy as process and in engagement with complexity. So they're the two main aspects that I wanted to bring out, really. The particular organisation that I'm working with has a commitment to face-to-face and informal interactions as part of their non-bureaucratic way of operating. How they think about their organisation is they want to see it as something that's not fixed, but is always in the process of becoming. And the emphasis on small-scale face-to-face interactions echoes a traditionally anarchist perspective, which, you know, is against people becoming too alienated from each other and reducing, you know, the territory and population over which domination might take place. And also, of course, you know, the idea of the state and state machinery using bureaucracy to co-opt or destroy the independence of grassroots organisations. What the anarchist perspective does is to combine small-scale practices with structural critique. As a negative political imaginary, the bureaucracy becomes horror, which stems in part from this replacement by state machinery of face-to-face encounters, you know, with these bureaucratic forms. And, you know, this is, so the oppression and horror starts when thinking stops, when people become cogs in the machinic state apparatus or get caught up in a kind of Kafkaesque, faceless absurdity and arbitrary justice. So briefly, I'm just going to take from a publication on a commons transition by the Peer-to-Peer Foundation, and looking at the way that they talk about bureaucracy as epitomising this depersonalisation and dehumanisation. They also use the idea of it being red tape, of getting in the way of innovation and individual initiative. For the P2P Foundation, bureaucracy is bound to be used to pursue private interests of lobby groups and concentrate centralised power. And what they suggest is that commons-based institutions might be able to assure more caring, conscientious and effective stewardship and resources that the bureaucratic state is than the bureaucratic state is capable of providing. So, you know, again, a sort of emphasis on caring, on social relations. And they put forward decentralised cooperative democracy as a kind of template. From a slightly different perspective, sociologist Mike Neary, a proponent of cooperative pedagogy, and he helped to set up a project called Student as Producer, and I can put the link in later if people are interested. And he has written in favour of bureaucracy and against peer-to-peer production. Neary on his blog entreats readers to build, repair and refurbish your infrastructures. And again, that's something we might want to pick up on later. He follows De Gay in arguing that bureaucracy is not only a type of administration, but a set of ethical and moral principles on which administration is based. And that bureaucracy, state bureaucracy, can actually promote individual autonomy and equal protection for citizens and even support the fight for workers' rights. While he concedes that bureaucracies can become, you know, snarled up, solid, rigid, sclerotic over time, he still thinks they ensure fairness through the operation of impersonal rules and structures. There's also a point about industrial bureaucracy replacing the irrationality of earlier forms of power, such as monarchy. And one of the critiques of peer-to-peer is that informality of power relations, you know, can allow mechanisms like charisma to create hidden hierarchies. One of the things that Weber's work on bureaucracy does, he suggests, is to remind us about the complexity of the bureaucratic form. So, and I'm going to come back to that point. On a smaller organisational scale, NERI has been involved in the setting up of Lincoln Social Science Centre, which no longer exists, but was an experimental educational cooperative. And this had a strong ethical and moral framework set out in its constitution, which again was based on the international cooperative movement. So it's quite interesting to me that both examples look at the co-op movement, you know, look to the co-op movement as a model. And I just want to kind of acknowledge here, especially after Matthew's talk yesterday, about some of the tensions and difficulties within the co-op movement. But I do think there are aspects there that can be looked at. So the desire for non-bureaucratic flexibility, certainly from looking at this organisation I've been working with, seems to get in the way of putting in structures, rules, policies, procedures, and can hinder the operations of an organisation. And this, I don't know, this is maybe a little bit tangential, but I think there is a possible link there to questions of strategy that came up yesterday in the discussion, and an anarchist distaste for things that look like plans and blueprints. But if we do look at the cooperative movement, and some of this is coming from my own experience of being involved with a housing co-op for a long time, is around rules and policies and how they operate. Rules are often locally agreed, and policies are also quite often seen as always being in draft form. So they're never complete, they're never fixed, they're never finalised, and they are more of a process rather than a fixed object. And certainly this is echoed in a recent article in New Formations that argues that a blanket disparagement of bureaucratic processes can overlook the potential processual relations of bureaucracy as an interface between policy making, community accountability, and interpersonal relationships, and as something that's not necessarily fixed. So bureaucratic decisions don't necessarily have to be final. You know, each decision can be productive. They get put into practice, and then maybe that opens up spaces for further negotiation and decision making. And that also, maybe that also raises questions about questions of scale, the interface between smaller organisations and the wider community, local government, etc. The last point I want to make is on the issue of complexity. And I think this is especially important to engage with as bureaucracy becomes more decentralised. So both political theorist Jane Bennett and David Graeber suggest that our relationship to bureaucracy is indicative of our relationship to human-made complexity. And Bennett asks how bureaucracy might appear if one loosened the Weberian iron cage, that's the quote, and stretched complexity theory to include man-made macroscopic systems. And both theorists even wonder about the possibility of a more imaginative or even poetic engagement with bureaucracy. And this, I think, holds out a particular challenge. So to engage with it, perhaps imaginatively, without losing the importance of interpersonal social relations or the larger structural critiques of power, which are really important. So in conclusion, you know, it seems important to engage with these arguments, to deconstruct them, and to engage with bureaucracy both practically and imaginatively, to see if we can rethink it, and thinking through things like policy and rules, processes, as well as engaging with complexity, to understand all the nuances, and particularly if we want to think about building effective alternative organisations, and maybe even social futures from the bottom up. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Very well timing. So let's just open the floor a little bit and see if anyone has any comments or questions for Claudia. You can either use the hand raise button or type something away in the chat. I'm seeing, I think I'm seeing it. Oh, Helena, please go on.
Okay, so thank you, Claudia. It was very interesting, your presentation, and it's quite close to some of the things I'm also exploring. So I have some questions to start with, and then maybe later on we can discuss a bit further. So my first question has to do with the anti-bureaucracy individualism. So I would like to ask you to say a bit more about that. And then my next question is, you mentioned Graeber, and some of his points were on against arbitrary power, right? So bureaucracy being a way to kind of protect a collective towards kind of power imbalances. I would like to ask how.
So you mean anti-bureaucracy or bureaucracy protecting?
How could bureaucracy protect equality or...
Okay. That's it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll start with the first one. That's actually not Graeber. I mean, Graeber, you know, he charts how bureaucracy, I mean, particularly how, for example, it took over grassroots institutions in, you know, Germany with the post office, and that was the start of the kind of bureaucratic welfare state and things. So he very definitely doesn't write in favour of bureaucracy in that way. But Mike Neary, the sociologist, does, and there's also a paper which I can put on, which is very much writing against peer-to-peer production and for bureaucracy. And the idea is that these that it kind of enshrines equality in the rules. That's where they're coming from. So that the kind of bureaucratic infrastructure sets out workers' rights and anti-discrimination rights and things. Now I would have to do more research on that to really see if that stands up, but certainly that's their argument, rather than kind of more informal relations.
I'm just saying that because there is no enforcement usually in these organizations, they're quite voluntary, right? So even if you have the best kind of collectively decided policies, rules, and so on, I can just say I'm not gonna do it.
Yeah.
You know? So
that's a whole nother.
Is it a way,
that's a whole nother thing around governance. Sure, that's a whole nother question, I think, around putting into practice policies that have been agreed, and creates all sorts of difficulties. In terms of anti-bureaucracy and individualism, I suppose again that links with what you're saying, Elena, that you know, a collective, and certainly I'm most interested in collectives and how collectives can agree and make decisions around governance. But of course, you know, in these informal organizations, you don't want to end up policing. I mean, that's you know, that's not a situation that as a collective you want to be put in. So I think, you know, there is a tension between particularly libertarian and anarchistic individualism, you know, tendencies towards individualism, and ideas about collectively decided rules and processes and procedures. Yeah, for sure. I don't know if that's really saying much. Sorry.
no worries.
I'm seeing a question in the chat. I could read it out loud, but Magdalena, you can most definitely unmute and make your question live.
Sure.
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now the dog starts to bark. Okay, maybe I won't.
Of course.
Right. So shall I read it then? Okay. So the comment says, thank you, Claudia. This is really helpful and relevant for my research. Could you talk more about language, perhaps, if you're looking at it in your paper? I'm thinking specifically about how our rigidity in relation to language might stop us from engaging in ideas like this.
Oh, wow, that's a really great question. I've only just started to look at this, so I haven't got more on it, but I think that this is really a good place to look into. And certainly, I think there's something perhaps quite interesting around the rigidity of language and rigidity of infrastructure. But I haven't done a lot more on it yet. But it's a great question. Maybe it's something we can discuss in the open discussion. Thank you. It's really great.
Excellent. Any more? I think we do have time for one more question or comment. I'm not seeing any. How are you thinking? I might as well ask one. So how about size? So you're looking into co-ops, etc. Is size an aspect that you're considering in your in the way that you're researching?
I think size is really important in a lot of different ways. So I think with a smaller organization that has some of these principles is in thinking about what those principles mean both for themselves as a smaller organization, but then how they interact with larger organizations, local government, etc., and what that critique means in terms of the state and larger structures in general. But also, yeah, of course, I mean, as soon as you get up to, you know, a larger scale, I mean, if I take my own personal example, I live in a housing co-op with, you know, over 100 members. This, of course, changes how an organization works and the role that policies, rules, infrastructure plays than if you're working within a more informal collective of like 10 people. I mean, you know, I think co-ops rely on policy quite a lot. But again, there's always this question of policing, which you don't want. You know, it's not a position that you want to be in. You don't want to be. I mean, you know, precisely, you've set up these organizations precisely not to be in that role of policing. So I think that Elena's point, it can come back to this as well as one of the questions, one of the tensions. Yeah.
Great.
Thanks, Chris.
So shall we progress with the next presentation and just save some time for the end? Elena, would you please go on with yours? If you have something to share, please do. You're still muted, by the way.
Let me know when you can see the presentation.
It's on.
Perfect.
Go on.
Okay, so if you cannot hear me very well, just let me know, okay? Because I don't know how my microphone works. So if I sound quite low, just let me know.
So far, so good.
Cool. So, just write down the time. Okay, so hello everyone, I'm Elena. I would like to say first that I'm really glad to be here, part of this conference. And a big thank you to Chris and the other organizers of Ephemera for putting together such meaningful and significant conference themes. As you can see from the slide, the title of the paper I submitted, it's still work in progress. It's called Organizing Equal Freedom, the Easy Rider Freeloader Reconfigured. As you can see from the picture, cooperative services carry on their back the Easy Rider, an Easy Rider though oblivious to the services he's getting. For whoever would like to get in touch, my email is on the slide. Okay, so before going to the main part of this presentation, I would just like to say a few words on the personal lenses I have and had on when conducting this research. So I come from an activist and practitioner background, and I was part of the broader social movement context, social and solidarity economy, this research focuses on. I knew to some extent most of the people involved. Nevertheless, I was not part of any of the collectives explored. A life previous to this one involved managing learning and change in IT projects, thus experience in human interactions, motivations, emotions. Both learning and change are challenging processes in every context. As I mentioned, I think already, I'm from Greece, and this is where I conducted my PhD fieldwork. I think I wanted to say that we're still quite traditional in terms of manifestations of patriarchy in relation to the UK, for example, and this happens both in mainstream and alternative settings. Thus, I've come across masculinities as that of the easy rider freeloader from a young age in their different variations. Finally, I'm quite new to academia. This is my first conference, and I'm in the 4th year of my PhD with Bristol University. Research motivation. Okay, so what was the motivation behind this research? The idea for this PhD started from the pains I experienced as an activist. Social movement settings are quite emotionally intense settings. So burnouts, intense conflicts, power plays, all these, at least from my experience, lead to disillusionment and movement shrinkage. We have taboos in Greece, and one might think that emotions are easy. We express them, yes, but we don't talk about them in our assemblies, at least. Finally, a key point I want to make, and a sad one, is that what is shared across the movement and its literature is the perception that problematic behaviors, such as the easy rider freeloaders, are inescapable. And the only solution is to manage them instrumentally. You know, maybe some of the things that Claudia was mentioning, with rules. I will argue against this perception in my paper. Thus, in search for solutions, for finding maybe the right words to see these problems through, this is the quest that appeared most burning to my mind, at least. To understand the conditions which enable, hinder, individuals within spaces of equal freedom to co-create the new in the now towards the quest for autonomy and a world different to capitalism. So what I will talk about today. Okay, due to time limitations mainly, I decided to follow a more traditional, maybe boring route, but with a twist. Thus, I will talk about the very classic stuff, current research gaps, and research contributions. On research gaps, I will make a particular plea, so wait for that. And finally, we'll provide some insights from the militant researcher approach to this study. Okay, so my research motivation that I just outlined transformed to be my research topic. And this falls under organization studies, critical management studies, and alternative organizing. It's a mouthful, so I'll try to be a bit slow when describing it. So it is on autonomous subjectivity formation through empathic interactions within prefigurative radical democracy settings striving for autonomy. I understand it's quite complex, but this specificity has a purpose, and I will show it later on. With autonomous subjectivities, I don't just refer to mere self-legislation. I refer to critical, deliberative, imaginative, and reflexive self-legislation that takes into consideration oppression stemming from historical, social, psychological, and power structures. With empathic interactions, I refer to the ways people try to understand each other towards co-constructing autonomy. The social movement settings are prefiguration and autonomy. There are three buckets of literature I'm placing my research in: alternative organizing, autonomy, and empathy. Okay, so most of you, I guess, are quite familiar with alternative organizing theorization. It was discussed a bit yesterday, and some gaps were kind of discussed as well. This theorization aims to focus, amongst other things, on the formations that sufficiently challenge the capitalistic "there's no alternative." Our lovely Tina. This theorization aims to capture the political and post-capitalistic dimension, as well as autonomy and organizing principles. Nevertheless, this literature is very limited, as was also mentioned yesterday. The same goes for prefiguration. Theorizing and alternative organizing on prefiguration, touching upon the transformation of relationships, is extremely limited. This creates quite a lot of difficulties when we're trying to discuss certain things. The empirical work under this theorizing is mostly on organizational levels rather than intra-organizational and interpersonal. Let me move now to autonomy. And again, I'm touching upon personal and interpersonal autonomy. Okay? So in both organizational studies and social movement studies, it's mostly discussed using concepts loosely defining self-legislation. The work is excellent, but these concepts could better grapple with key concept limitations and constraints, as with affective elements. The case studies explored are mostly on mobilization, with autonomy explored mostly on organizational and transnational levels. Again, more work is needed on the context of prefiguration and autonomy, and more work is needed on intra-organizational tensions. Empathy. So for this presentation, I'm only touching upon CMS work on empathy. Okay? So in CMS, the concepts mostly used come from feminist ontologies and epistemologies that place empathy within the ethics of care, thus proposing it as instrumental, essentialist, normative, and while prioritizing embodied knowledge. The case studies explored are mostly within the context of mobilization rather than prefiguration and autonomy. Thus, the gaps I've identified are the following, as I already mentioned to some good extent. Okay. I will give you just a few seconds to read through them. Okay. So what I find most overwhelming about these academic gaps, which also stands for social movement literature, is that internal tensions and conflicts are left unattended. Okay? The same goes for oppressions and inequalities. Thus, the point I mostly want to make with this slide is really a plea for papers that do address intra-organizational problems on the interpersonal level. As I highlighted in the beginning of this presentation, everyday prefiguration on interpersonal relationships is not an easy task. We need more research on this. Okay, so I'll touch upon a bit on the contributions, okay? So what I'm trying to do with this paper, as well as with my upcoming PhD, in order to address these tensions I already mentioned. So my aim is to argue towards the importance of affective elements, including the political dimension of empathy in alternative organizing praxis, and in particular, organizing equal freedom, collective co-construction. Due to time limitations, I will not talk through this slide. We'll give you just a few moments to read it, and I can pick up any questions you might have in the discussion part. I hope this time is okay. Okay. One last thing about contributions, and it has to do with the militant researcher hat I have on. What I consider as the most significant contribution, as many of you here probably will too, is the contribution to the movement. So my hope is just to ease the pains of people in the field, help in terms of radical social change through aiding the transformation of relationships. This has driven my research mostly. Okay, so let me recap what we've seen so far. I started this presentation from my personal positionality and activist motivations, made the connection to my research topic, and then outlined current research gaps and contributions. I will now go back to this personal positionality. Although the usual sequence, I guess, in academia is read, find gaps, contribute, as a militant researcher, I followed a different path, which drove my supervisors crazy, but we managed to get everything in. So, as I already mentioned, I identified initially the problem in the field. Okay. What I did then, I found theoretical tools that have formed and will speak to the people in the field. Okay. The concepts I used come from Kypkiolis, an academic involved in the movement for years, and they mostly draw from Foucault and Castoriadis, which are widely read and endorsed in the movement in Greece. Although these authors' theories are usually used to critique the current social and political system, I'm using them towards the movement itself. Thus, I'm trying to make it as difficult as possible for people not to listen. Furthermore, taking empathy as an example, but it could as well apply for agonistic self-creation and agonistic pluralism, I'm using ontologies that match the social movement context. Okay? So as in this case of autonomy, which is inevitably anti-oppressive, cannot be normative, and prefiguration, which has to do with inseparability of means and ends, so I cannot be instrumental, I'm steering empathy away from normative, essentialist, and instrumental approaches. Okay, so that was all. I hope I'm on time. Unfortunately, didn't have time to talk about the actual Easy Rider freeloader, but you can find my paper in the conference folder, and happy to pick up any questions on him or anything else that was part of these presentations. I have one small request. If there are any suggestions on literature on interpersonal tensions in radical democracy settings, it would be lovely to hear them. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. You were extremely within the time limits. So let's open up the floor and see if someone has a comment or a question for Elena. Again, you can use the raise hand, the digital hand, or, oh, go on, Claudia.
Sorry, muted. Yeah, I would like to hear about the freeloader a little bit.
What exactly? Because there is a lot of.
I suppose it's in relation to the questions that you've asked me. So around, you know, if you have a collective and they've made some decisions about how things are going to operate and be governed, and then you have individuals who are part of that movement but really freeloading, as you say, or there for the ride, just doing what they want to do. They're not bothered about these things that have been agreed.
Yeah. So what can I say about the freeloader in terms of that? So the freeloader himself sees that the problem of compliance, right? So he sees himself as some kind of revolutionary. Right? So he thinks he's being like a disobedient radical, and he's to an extent oblivious about the inequalities his participation brings. Okay, so to his mind is, okay, there are collective decisions, but I will not comply because I perceive myself as this revolutionary. Okay, to some extent he's conscious of, he's not conscious of the inequality. To some extent he is. Okay, but I don't see the problem there, like in this compliance kind of debate. That's why I was asking you before. The problem that at least I saw in the research when it came to his form of participation was around the concept of the collective. It's an adjective we use in the Greek context, and it has to do with the collective imaginary or the collective spirit, the collective mentality. Okay, so it's about interdependence. So the breakthrough, let's say, in this story was around this concept and in relation to self-organization. Okay, you mentioned a bit before that bureaucracy was in tension with other values. Okay, so indeed, this compliance is in tension with self-organization and this concept of collectivity. But this persona, it's not the person, it's this persona, like you see him in many different kinds of settings when it comes to alternative organizing, he's not really conscious of what collectivity means, okay? And the problem within this setting is that we have a perception that, oh yeah, we all know what that means, and it's the same, okay? So there are many feelings triggered because of these kind of false perceptions. It has to do with, yeah, we all understand fairness, self-organization, co-accountability, equality in the same way, and how come this persona behaves so unequally? But he doesn't get it, and they don't get it. He doesn't get it. So it's bringing to awareness how each one of the group members conceives this, it perceives this collectivity, okay, and perceives self-organization, equality, and so on. And only then, at least in my story, that person really got it. Because before he would do maybe what you see in your kind of study, he would just go on and not be compliant.
Great, thank you.
Any more comments or questions? Marco, please go
on. Hi, Elena. I read your paper, and I really enjoyed it. I have like a couple of questions in mind. Like, first of all, I think it's something that is in there, but it doesn't really come out, and I think is the effect of patriarchy. To the extent, like, I don't think it's a coincidence that you characterize the persona as a Yannis, and then you characterize the other person that initiates the process of letting him understand what's wrong with the Marta, I think it was. So I think like that can pop up a little bit more, because like I think is integral. I mean, to the way in which like male masculinity subjectivations in a patriarchal world like cannot be scrapped completely once you enter an organization of this kind. For as much as you, because it was interesting that you can have like all sorts of political principles, but then there is something that is holding him back, right? Like he's, and the second point is, well, I have more points actually. But another point is about the use of Berlin on negative freedom. I think it was a bit too harsh on him. I mean, like, it's like it's I think it's a very big call, right? Like that he's doing it like from that perspective, which is obviously like, I mean, because like I recognize part of the conflict, like of the psychological conflict going on in there, and I mean, accusing him of having a totally neoliberal personality of selfishness, like it's, I think it, because like I think what I'm trying to say is like, it's very interesting how you bring out like this process of sort of collective education and how we can sort of change our, transform our subjectivities by reflecting on what we are in order to change that. So I think that's, you know, I don't know, like I wanted to know more about like this kind of issues, this kind of aspects.
Cool. Yeah, about masculinities. Yeah, it's in my mind, right? Because I'm not doing gender analysis, so I'm doing about understand, like process of understanding, that do try to bring in as content the different types of oppressions, and sexist oppressions are amongst these, right? So I'm like, okay, I'm bringing them in, but how do I not make them the main thing? Okay, because it is indeed women that do bring these topics, and they do put all this emotional work, okay, to make him understand, to bring the reflection in and so on. But the tension is really on collectivity and self-organization. So I'm like, okay, this was the thing that brought the breakthrough. So I understand gender plays a role, because it's usually men that do take these kind of personas, like these roles, and it's usually women that do all this emotional work, you know, to find the balance and make them do what they need to do. So it's still in my mind, how do I bring it in without making it the you know, the center of this story? Because from my experience, it's not. It's not. So I'm still thinking on it, and thank you for the comment on that. On Berlin, yeah, I'm you're right. I'm quite emotionally involved, so I will try to, you know, take away all these you know, yeah, you're right. It was a fair kind of critique. I'll try to be kinder.
All right. Any more comments or thoughts or questions for Elena? Not seeing any. Oh, now I am. Yusra, please.
Thank you very much, Elena. Very interesting stuff. I apologize, I didn't read the paper. And you finished, and I'm interested in what you finished with, which is you mentioned back again these concepts or practices of what agonistic self-creation and agonistic pluralism. And I'm sure like it's complex and long, but if you can, I'm very interested in that. If you can say a few words about what it entails and how you use it, because you said you're using it not the way it was developed originally as a critique or as a as applied to another kind of actor. Thank you.
So these concepts, what they do, they bring mostly work from Foucault and Castoriadis. Right? So self-legislation is not just mere, I'm making my own rules. So they try to bring in the historical, psychological, social kind of oppressive elements into this self-reflection. Okay, so be critical, deliberative, self-reflexive, this process of self-creation. With Copiolis bringing in the work of Castoriadis, he tries to draw in some kind of creative element, so imagination, the radical imaginary. This also comes in this concept of collectivity that I mentioned. We say the collective, but the collective imaginary, what do we mean with that? You know, it kind of is in the air. So these concepts try to bring these elements in to understand all of the different kind of oppressions that come into our process of deconstructing and creating the new. Because these are quite abstract concepts, I brought in empathy. So I'm like, okay, how does this happen? How can I make it practical, like concrete? Okay, what is the process? So empathy has that kind of power It's like, oh, I go into the other person's shoes and so on. Okay, so it's like, okay, like some of the theories I'm using on empathy have to do with introspection. Okay? Introspection as a meaning-making process. Okay, so when I go into this introspection, can I do it with the agonistic self-creation way? Or when I'm seeing you, can I do it in the agonistic pluralism kind of way? Empathy allows me, the concept allows me to bring in also emotions. The other concepts do not really discuss them sufficiently. And this work I actually need to do as I progress this research. Okay, so that's why I brought in empathy to bring the other two in a more concrete way.
Great, thank you. So we might have time for one more since we started earlier, but if no more questions pop up, I see a comment maybe. Oh, Aviv. Okay. You can read it out, Helena. And you can also see a couple of paper suggestions I'm seeing now. Maybe you're familiar with them or not, but could be useful if you haven't. So shall we carry on with the presentation then? Hopefully we'll have some more time at the end. Yes? Aviv, I think you're next in the schedule, so please
Hi,
share.
everyone.
All right.
Can you hear me? So first, thanks for organizing this, and thanks for putting me in this session. I feel really at home with everything that's being discussed. Like everything is really relevant and making me rethink and doubt what I'm about to say. So that's useful. My name is Aviv. I'm a PhD student at the University of Hull, studying alternative forms of organizing, and specifically I'm focusing on issues relating to control and to spontaneity. So it's very much related to everything that's been discussed so far. I'm also a longtime participant in social movements. So I was participating in art activism collectives, and I went to a bunch of counter summits in the early 2000s, and later spent several years squatting in Barcelona, and now living in the UK and still friendly with social movements, let's say. Can't seem to get myself out of it. So this is based on one section basically of one of my PhD chapters, and it has to do with literature. And I don't have time to do a good job and go into all the citations in the literature. So I'm just going to extract kind of like a skeleton of the argument. So what you're going to hear are a series of blunt statements that you might either agree or disagree with. And I do have a bunch of literature, and it's also way in the background. There's also like my personal experience and my own reflections of my participation in activist movements that kind of informed this. So it has to do with basically with the concept of spontaneity, and I'm gonna kind of, I was hoping for it to be more of a conversation than a presentation. So I don't know how brief I'm gonna actually manage to be, but I'm gonna leave it unresolved. So it's really just, I'm gonna present just some questions and doubts. I'm gonna leave it unresolved in the thesis. Obviously, I respond to these through like this action research and ethnographic work that I've been doing in two specific organizations. So we're talking about spontaneity. The Cambridge Dictionary defines it as the quality of being natural rather than planned in advance. Okay, so there are other definitions that take it in different directions, but this is the one that kind of interests me because it positions spontaneity as a sort of antonym to planning. Okay, planning, you can say, is something that expresses control temporally. The way we experience a lot of control is through the planning and strategizing that goes on in different organizations we interact with. and spontaneity is kind of something unplanned, emerging, something celebratory, maybe celebratory, but something unplanned. So the literature I review and the chapter shows that participants in social movements often represent their own activities as spontaneous or similarly contrary to control. And this kind of has been mentioned already in the other presentations. So people talk about fluidity and process-based and about spontaneity directly. At the same time, social movements themselves, these are my blunt statements that you might not agree with, but social movements themselves tend to spend ample time on what I call in the chapter protocolization. So I just have it on a piece of paper. I see it as the work of, can you hear me? Okay. The work of thinking up and debating norms, procedures, and methods to confront both moral and political dilemmas. Protocol for communication and decision-making designed to eschew hierarchical, exploitative, colonialist, and patriarchal relations as they perceive them in mainstream forms. Okay, so there's a lot of literature that discusses this, and so the result is obviously very creative and innovative. And there's a lot of examples of different ways that different protocols and different ways people kind of create non-hierarchical structures, very inspiring. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of examples, but I can go into them later if it comes up in the conversation. But also the result has also been called the bureaucracies of anarchy, and has been recorded as elements that contribute to the homogeneity of social movements. So even consensus-based decision-making has been discussed as filtering out communities that are not white, middle class, and university educated. So it's creative on one hand, and it's kind of contrary to the kind of diversity and the democratizing goals of social movements in the other. I forgot to mention at the beginning of the presentation something I wanted to say. Any criticisms towards social movements that I present here, I mean, like, I'm assuming like other people here, I mean, I perceive them as self-criticism. So it's not like I'm some outsider that's just going to try, and I think it's all like the other people here. I'm grappling with it as a result of my personal experience, and like Ellen has said, the I don't know, maybe suffering is like a hard word, but experiences that made me think about these things. So while social movements seem to express a critique of control and a yearning for forms that escape it, in fact, many of the practices of social movements reproduce control. Now, how do social movement scholars engage in the concept of spontaneity? So first, something that might seem not relevant to exactly the point I'm making here, but I think it's interesting to consider is spontaneity is defined in a very linear and directional way. It's something happening out of the blue. So, you know, walking down the street and, you know, a protest erupts. And I think that's, that kind of informs the way they deal with spontaneity as well. So then they, as spontaneity is something that erupts suddenly out of the blue, out of the ether, as one of the scholars said. And then it's also historically in the conversations of social movement studies is associated with something that's reactive and mindless. So that's my impression from the literature that I read, that even from way back, I don't have it here in front of me, there's a perception of spontaneity as something that's more associated with protest, with opposing, than with prefiguration, with proposing, with organizing. So it's kind of, let's say, to be very, and like all these are simplifications, I understand, but it's excluded from the process of alternative organizing. It's more something that like some sort of reaction, like a mass reaction to something, you know, that spreads like wildfire. That kind of like language has been used to describe it. So then, considering all these things, all these thoughts that inform the definition of and the perception of spontaneity, social movement scholars tend to debunk it or explain it away. Because I'm interested in spontaneity as something really, some element outside of human control that you dialogue with, like it's like an ingredient of your recipe for alternative organizing. So I mean, it's something outside of human control tends not to be considered when you think about discussing how you organize alternatively. So social movement scholars, as I saw them, they either explain it as a narrative device. Activists talk about spontaneity because it's useful to explain things that they do as spontaneous. It's useful to represent it as spontaneous. Some of these are very beautiful. These are like insightful analysis of things that happen in social movement. I don't disagree with them. I just think that they kind of reject the possibility of looking at something else. Then the other thing is they see it as a misunderstanding. So, you know, the researcher was there, didn't realize the planning that was going on and they perceived things as being spontaneous. And then there's also explained as spontaneity does exist, but it's really just a fast form of decision making. So it falls under the kind of like causalities of decision making. So I see this as being done for two reasons, basically. One is because spontaneity is perceived as reactive and as mindless. A lot of social movement scholars are kind of have affinity to social movements, and they want to represent social movements as thoughtful and as capable. So they don't want to associate them with spontaneity. They want to associate them with strategizing, with planning, with capable of creating real alternatives. And the other reason is that it feels unscientific to see a phenomenon and say it's spontaneous. It has a history. You know, like say there's Van Helmont that said that, you know, back in the I don't remember 17th century that they could produce spontaneously produce mice out of dirty shirts. So that's the kind of like history of spontaneity seems unscientific. So for social scientists to recur to this seems unscientific, like you're not explaining the causalities of play. So why is spontaneity worth considering? First, because planning and controlling are ubiquitous, synonymous with organizing, a deeply ingrained common sense. So when you're looking at alternatives, I think there's like something, it's so central, this like idea of control is so central to mainstream organization, even though now there's all these examples kind of at the margins of the mainstream that also kind of challenge that. But Theory U and that kind of stuff. But so I think as an alternative, I think it's interesting to consider it's something that challenges control and even challenges planning. And it's also through this ubiquity, through this kind of feeling of common sense that alternatives are rejected as unimaginable. They're deemed unimaginable. And then another reason why I think spontaneity is worth considering is that the idea that something unplanned, something that breaks with existing structures of thought, even challenging causality to a certain extent, is useful for those trying to imagine and enact alternatives. So because this kind of it's like something the idea of something surprising happen is kind of linked with utopian thought. You know, if it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, if we're in the middle of a crisis of the imagination, the idea of something surprising happening is, as I said, intimately linked with utopian thought. And then lastly, last blunt statement, if ideas deemed common sense need to be reframed, like some scholars say, to make sense, make space for alternatives, there might be some room to consider dialoguing with elements outside of human control, maybe considering reframing our common sense thinking about spontaneity, planning, and controlling. So I'm going to leave it at that. I would love to hear any insults, responses.
Hopefully we'll keep things vanilla, but I already see raised hands. So Claudia, the floor is yours for now.
Hi, thank you. Really interesting. Thanks, Aviv. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've looked at this at all, but what the thought that came to my mind was around, ideas around distributed and embodied mind. So you were talking about spontaneity being around or being associated with mindlessness and not an unthinking, as opposed to control and planning. And I was wondering about, ideas of distributed and embodied mind as being something in between those things somehow. That there are ways of thinking that are not thinking or planning as kind of putting on from the top, from the outside. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, actually, that's exactly the direction this is going. I'm not really using the term distributed and embodied mind, even though I'm researching this really through art processes. So I'm doing kind of participatory action research, art-based in neighborhoods, and that's how I'm going about it. And one of the people I'm reading is kind of this art anthropologist, Roger Sancy, and he mentions theories of distributed and embodied mind quite a lot in relation to, I don't know if anyone's interested in art here, but things like found objects and that kind of these kind of art practices where agency or your attention is spread. So when I was referring to this idea of that spontaneity is defined linearly and directionally, that's kind of where I'm taking at is as spontaneity in the organizations that I'm researching is found more in the encounter. So it's spontaneity is not something that happens like it can't. If you describe it linearly, I kind of understand why you would want to debunk it. But if you say it's just an openness for something unpredictable happening, something out of your control, but it's intersubjective. It happens in the encounter with an idea or a person or a group or an organization that's outside. So it has to do with, I mean, some of these other definitions of spontaneity don't talk so much about spontaneity, something unplanned. They talk more about spontaneity, about this internal, external. They associate spontaneity more with autonomy. So it has to do with, what are your boundaries, as a movement, as an organization, and what's your treatment with the outside. Had to do with this idea of policing that people were talking about, because when you're policing, you're really policing the boundaries of your organization. I don't know if that was really abstract and weird, but.
No, that's great, thanks.
Elena, would you like to comment? Or?
Yeah. Just to share mainly some thoughts on this, because as you were saying, like being spontaneous is quite key in order to maybe find some creativity or in order maybe to bring imagination in these settings. So I was trying to think about it in terms of, again, the collectivity. So what kinds of spontaneity could actually take these collectives forward, or maybe be within that their imaginary? So again, I'm thinking like, are there forms of spontaneity that are individualistic? So I'm doing it just to, I don't know, do my own thing. Is that the thing? Or I'm doing it to do my own thing, but it's within that collective imaginary. So I'm still connected to that. If there are variations when it comes to this. Also, spontaneity. I don't know what can be really spontaneous, right? Where does it come from? What kind of reflexes do we have, or what kind of maybe stereotypical, even alternative stereotypical behaviors do we put in this spontaneity, right? So in Nazima Kantir's ethnography, she discusses a bit about this kind of performances, spontaneous, but give people kind of social movement capital. So these are my thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. I think they're exactly the kind of relevant thoughts. It's spontaneity is if you look at it individually, as an individual spontaneity, if you, well, more than individual, again, I would see it as a question of the directionality of it, because I think there are small scale cases of spontaneities like that involve individuals, but if it's just you know, this kind of act of like, I do something unpredictable, so that's what I mean by directionality. It comes from me towards the outside. I just do something unpredictable. But if something unpredictable happens, like I meet an other, so it's really more about openness. Something up, I'm encountering another. It can happen on an individual level between a person and an idea, a person and another person, a person and different kind of activities. These are kind of my observations. And if there's an openness towards it, that's like an openness to a kind of, well, my thesis, I call it an ecological spontaneity. So it is, I am looking at it collectively. I'm looking at how it's kind of like a value, and people talked about how there are kind of these anti-bureaucratic values, maybe in anarchist settings, and the organizations I'm looking at do come from that background. So how that is interpreted organizationally, how do you interpret this kind of openness to something outside of human control, becoming central to what you do as an organization?
All right. Any more comments or questions for Aviv? Let me see the chat. No?
Okay.
All right, but we do have some more time, so perhaps you can, Aviv, problematize this a bit more if you want.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's also again, it's a question of absolutes. I thought about this a lot when I was listening to Claudia's presentation about bureaucracies. I mean, when you talk about bureaucracy and anti-bureaucracy, like I think someone mentioned that a question of that it could be like a rigidity of language, and I don't know if they were referring to that, but that creates a situation where you're not. I mean, in the thesis, I'm using the metaphor of recipes, so I'm thinking about how things that are in tension or in different quantities could exist in a process of organizing. So there's definitely protocols. There's definitely an element of bureaucracy. There's definitely planning, but then there's this other element. So because I feel like there's a general imbalance. Like I think we live in a society that's where the kind of the mainstream, the ubiquitous value is more of control, even though the imaginary is about freedom. So I highlight this element of spontaneity, but not as an absolute. I think it's a question of working your way through it as you letting things unfold and seeing when you need what, like ingredients in a recipe.
Yeah. All right. So if no one has a immediate response to this, then perhaps we can proceed with Marco's presentation and hopefully have, we're still within schedule, so I do believe there will be some time to collectively interact at the end. If you have a presentation, Marcos, share it with us, please. If not, then just go on.
So, yeah, should be working. Yes. Can you see it? Can you see my slides? Yeah.
We can, yes.
Good. I see them really small though. I don't know why. Anyway, so I'm presenting these like yeah, it's a paper that we try to write together with George, who couldn't be here today, on the case of an occupation of a hospital in Italy. We got interested into the story a bit because just like it was kind of unique, or I never heard before of like occupation of hospitals, and I thought it's very with COVID times, like it was really interesting that this happened. And also because like together with George, we've done some previous research on a solidarity social clinic in Greece, in Thessaloniki, Kia, and we're thinking of expanding like these models on our research on this alternative way of organizing or self-organizing healthcare and care in general. So this is where our interest in this case study came from. I will try to give you a bit of an overview of what happened with this story in particular, so how the occupation unfolded, and we'll talk briefly through a history of occupation of healthcare facilities, and then towards the end, I will try to elaborate like on a theoretical framework that we've been trying to develop together with George. Possibly has a lot of connection with other theoretical frameworks, but it's a bit experimental. We're not really aware of the others that have been thinking in those terms. So it would be good to hear some feedback, and especially if you find like other connections that we couldn't find out. So I'll start with the study of Cariati, which is like this really little town in Calabria. Calabria is in the south of Italy. It's basically the top of the boot, if you have like an idea of Italy in mind. It's a very deprived area in the sense that it's one of the poorest regions in Europe in terms of GDP, for instance, but also more practically in terms of infrastructure. Cariati has a very interesting story because like it's a territory and a community that was characterized for many years of strong migration. So lots of people were leaving the town. So there were just like a few thousand people, I think like 4,000 around the 70s. And then this process changes when the hospital opens in Cariati in 1978. Now, what's interesting about this is that like it's not just a hospital, and you get the feeling that it's not just a hospital from the very beginning of telling the story, or how the people perceive the hospital within the community. So you need to imagine like a town in which basically there is absolutely nothing except for a beautiful seaside and some hills. The moment that the hospital arrives there, it becomes also an economic opportunity. There is one that says that one of the interview that we had, like he said, our hospital was like a Fiat in Turin. It was the economic motor of our town. And I think it really gives the idea of how a hospital can become like a small factory for the town. So it's a big transformation, and it changes the whole aspect of migration. So we have a lot of people that were going to study in the cities of the north that finally can use their degrees in order to work in Cariati, so in this little town. So we have like sort of process of counter migration. And at the same time, we have a process in which like the migration is halted because people do not need to go to Germany. Germany was like one of the main destinations for those people in order to work. to find a job. So this changes the perspective of the town completely. The hospital creates a completely different feeling about the community and about the territory, and the population grows, like it grows up to 12, 14,000 inhabitants. This changes radically in 2010 with the closure of the hospital in Cariati. How is this connected with COVID is very interesting, because like obviously the closure of the hospital happened 11 years ago, and we have the occupation today. So how to make sense of this? It's very beautiful that one of the people that we interviewed said, our COVID started 11 years ago. It's like if COVID is not just this pandemic, but is a form of degradation, is a form of destruction of the community, of destruction of an ecology. That's how I want to picture it. Is the destruction of and the disruption of our whole ecology, in which we see that like things start to change and going towards despair. Despair in the sense that there is like a feeling of hopelessness, a feeling of there's nothing can be done in order to repair what it seems to be lost. Here I wanted to show you a bit the map of Cariati. You cannot see, I guess you don't have like a real feeling from it, but I try to put the distance from the nearest hospital, which is like 32 kilometers. So that can give you, on a very slow kind of highway. No, it's not a highway. There's like a main big street, but it's not a highway. So you have a complete lack of infrastructure. Some that characterize like as a post-apocalyptic scenario where ugliness has pervaded everything. There is a sense of underdevelopment in this degradation, in this destruction, and obviously like the lack of a hospital the lack of a hospital and healthcare, while you have a structure that is perfectly functioning, because of what I forgot to mention before, as you can see, as you could see in the very first opening slide, is that the hospital is there materially. The building is there. The building could be functional. It could be reopened tomorrow. What is missing is basically investment and people. In general, there is a total lack of infrastructure in this region, and this obviously changed completely the perspective of the community. And I want to insist on the idea of ecology. I will explain more towards the end. So we have like a damaged ecology in the sense that people have to leave. The territory is changing and the infrastructures are abandoned. So I call ecology this idea of interrelation that there is between beings, human beings and non-human beings, things or infrastructures like the hospital or the building of the hospital that is no longer a hospital, and the territory in its, let's say, natural resources. Now, the way in which like is depicted today in this scenario of degradation is that this ecology is damaged. At the same time, what comes up from this resistant action of the occupation of the hospital is that there is potential for repairing. So putting together those resources and those potentialities in order to create an ecology that is sustainable, is functional, and can attract people to return to Cariati. So we see that, like, first of all, there are imaginaries of these potentialities. And from the interviews that I conducted separately with each member of the occupation, it was beautiful to observe how these potentialities are expressed with actual other regions that can be alternative or utopic scenarios of creation from below. And we have one that spoke about California, possibly never been to California itself, but like this idea that our land is beautiful, our community is wonderful, we have a lot of potential, the sea is beautiful, we have the hills, so we could be as good as California, for whatever that would mean. And instead, another one that is much more political, in which is like, wow, we could be like Rojava, like a sort of a self-organization from below, where we provide the service because the state is completely absent. So the state is not there at all. So we can have is a pre-revolutionary kind of context in which we can build our own services from below and our own self-government, and that's how we build up autonomy. So to some extent, like the potential is there, and the potential is there, and what this resistant action, what this resistance represents, like the resistance represented by the occupation of the hospital, is that this potential can actually transform things and transform the whole ecology by repairing it. So it was very interesting because, like, when I was talking to the guys in the occupation, and also from a very brief research done initially, there seemed to be no cases in history of occupational hospitals. Obviously, like, occupations are a very common form of resistance. It's something well established in the repertoire of resistance. But the occupation of hospitals seems something like, well, surprising. I mean, like, and possibly we go back to Aviv presentation earlier, like this idea of spontaneous and surprising, even though it's not surprising. It's not surprising because, like, eventually we found out that there are a lot of examples, especially in the UK in the 70s up to the 90s. We have the occupation of several hospitals that were threatened with closures. I try to list a few. I'm not sure that if the list is exhaustive. Possibly there were more. Possibly there were also occupation of hospitals in other countries. What I think is different between those occupation and the occupation of the hospital in Cariati is that there was like a facilitation, so to speak. Like in the UK, given that if there were patients within these hospitals, it was possible for the workers that occupy the hospital to continue to get paid. Instead, in Cariati, we no longer have any worker available, and so that makes the running of the hospital impossible, even though we propose that to them. We try to look at example of recuperated clinics, which is obviously very different because, like, it's a matter of size. It's still a healthcare facility, but running a hospital, which has a much bigger infrastructure, is very different from running a smaller clinic. So these are above a bit the references that we try to think of. But at the same time, it was really interesting that these occupiers didn't know anything about these experiences. So they literally thought that they were the first in history to have tried, and we thought that as well, that they tried this form of resistance. We go to the occupation, the actual occupation in Cariati. It was in November, and it was beautiful that, like, they characterized this occupation as extremely spontaneous and unplanned. Now, I don't think that was either spontaneous and neither unplanned, to the extent that, like, them talking to them, they say, we've been doing occupation of everything in the past 10 years. You know, like we were occupying for against because the closure of a street, they were occupying for that reason. So it was there somehow as a possibility. I really, just in terms of practices and in terms of ontology, really, nothing is completely spontaneous. I'm sorry, I'm going too much against the Aviv's presentation, but it's a bit challenging, that idea that, like, there is a memories of struggle and there is an attunement of resistance with possibilities and potentialities that obviously make things less spontaneous, less surprising. I mean, I'm not saying that everything is, like, predetermined, but, like, we can include those possibilities within our actual resistances. Obviously, COVID was the perfect occasion in terms of timing, but also was, like, a very important movement that changes, like, this isolation and solitude and individualism and frustration into a collective action. Now, in terms of resistance and in terms of, obviously, like, when we talk about occupation, when we talk about the resistance is against a number of elements that are I don't know how to put it, like, but we have a resistance against eviction, first of all. Obviously, if you occupy a space that does not belong to you, there is the threat of eviction. So in that sense, resistance goes against eviction, but also against all sorts of other logics of austerity, of the closure of the hospital, of the privatization of healthcare, and so on and so forth. What is interesting here, and what is interesting more in general in my understanding of resistance, is that it would be very reductive to reduce resistance to its enemy, to the element that stands in opposition to resistance, so the specific power that resistance has to face. And instead, we can think of resistance as affirmative, as having to oppose to power just accidentally, so to speak, rather than essentially as part of its own nature. I'll try to explore that towards the end. In this case, it was interesting that there've been the occupiers have been there for 7 months now, and there was no attempt of eviction. Because obviously eviction will not be convenient for the state and for the police, because that would just highlight how incompetent they have been in not providing the healthcare that was needed, especially in a moment in which, with COVID, there is a manifest lack of healthcare infrastructures. So they're building they're rushing to build up temporary hospitals in tents and or military tents and stuff like that. And instead, we have structures that are actually ready to be used. What is interesting is also that it has become something completely different from just a resistance about healthcare, but it's become a resistance about community. So about building community, about being expansive in creating a space of aggregation in a community that was completely dead, not just damaged, but completely dead. And the fact that it brings back life into this community is already an achievement, is already a victory, despite the initial objective was not even that one. So I go towards the last section, which is it tries to be more theoretical, although it doesn't have any citation. So I've been trying to think this occupation in relation to the idea of resistance, repair, and return. Besides the fact that it can be really fancy to put a dash between the words, so it looks a bit more clever, but I think that when we have a disruption, we have the separation of elements, right? And in the case of an ecology like that of Cariati, we can think a separation between the territory, the infrastructure, and the people that are forced to migrate, to leave. So leaving for finding jobs, leaving for finding better lives, and so on. So there is a separation. Now, this separation is basically a rupture of the pairing that kept them together. And at the same time is a form of despair, desperation. Now, repairing is an attempt of reconstituting those bonds, or recoupling or pairing once again what was separated. So if we understand of an ecology as something made of interrelation, once those relations are broken, repairing comes as a form of putting those relations back together. And I think this is an act of resistance, if we understand resistance, as I've been doing, as affirmative, as about transformation, as about creation. That doesn't mean that doesn't have to do with opposition at all. But what I'm trying to do is to highlight more the creative stance rather than its oppositional stance. And in that sense, resistance goes a bit as a form of renovation of existence. So a transformation, radical transformation of existence. Now, in this particular case, I think it was worth reflecting also, and I conclude here, with the idea of an occupation that is something that is a form of settlement, right? It's something static to an extent. We take a space, we take a stand, and we stay here with the idea of migration. Because everybody in the occupation interpreted this bit as an occasion for other people that are living abroad to return to Cariati. Also, long-standing migrants that have been living in Germany for many years if there is a hospital that can be given the opportunity to come back and enjoy their retirement years back in Cariati. So there is this idea of returning. And returning is also the idea of turning things around, like in changing and transformation and transforming the whole ecology. So this is just to conclude. It was interesting how a static form of resistance as occupation can become an actioning of a series of movements that have to do both with repair and with returning to a community that was abandoned. And I think I can conclude here.
Thank you, Marco, for your very interesting presentation. So, do you have any immediate reactions or questions for Marco? Let me have time. Can you just tell us what is there some sort of central activity in that hospital currently? So is there some form of production? And by the way, I really dig your t-shirt.
Thank you. That was interesting because like our initial proposition with George was like trying to sort of suggest the idea that could reactivate the hospital as a self-organized clinic. Now, that was like our contribution as like a researchers and activists. But what he did, like it was like to trigger a big discussion among the people in the occupation. But then they were facing a practical impossibility that they don't have the people. As simple as that, because like all people have left and there are no people with medical expertise in the whole area. So it's not even like that there are no people that are willing to volunteer or to be active in offering some kind of healthcare service. It's just like there is nobody there. I mean, like there is nobody with a medical degree. At some point when we told them like we can put you in contact with Kia, which is this social clinic in Thessaloniki, they were saying like let the they just need to come here and start the clinic. It's like, yeah, that would be nice, but obviously there are some material kind of struggle in doing that. So at the moment, like there is no form of healthcare provision, and that has become like basically a social center. So there were no place where they could meet. And now this is finally the place where they can meet, they can bring. It was interesting. At some point, somebody says like, there is a lot of solidarity. There are people that bring food. There are people that bring drinks. There are people that bring cigarettes, which I found really, sort of old-fashioned. Like histories from the Second World War, in which like cigarettes were sort of a luxury, and so it was like very, very beautiful as an experiment, but like with his own tension, with his own struggles that are derived from the fact that he's like an ecology completely devastated.
Right. So I guess there is a certain sense of spontaneity, right? In the cigarettes. Claudia, please, if you have a comment.
Yeah, thank you, Marco. I really enjoyed that. Thanks. I was just thinking about your concept of returning. And with a lot of the other ones that you were working on, you had pairs, you had couples of concepts. But with that one, you didn't. And I'm wondering if you'd thought about pairing it with detourning. So like, it seems to me that's, it's the situationist concept of hijacking or rerouting something. And it seems to me that fits with what's happening there with the occupation, that it's because of course it's not returning, it's going somewhere else as well. It's doing something else. So I was just wanted to wonder if you'd come across that, or whether that was something you could look at.
Thank you, because like I didn't have any idea. I'm not familiar with that concept, and I think it will fit perfectly. It will fit very beautifully with the because like the initial idea was simply working on this idea of resistance and repair, but then this idea of returning like really came up through the interviews. I mean, they were all talking about like this movement, this migration and counter-migration, if you want to call it counter-migration, or this possibility of returning back home. And so it was very new, and we added the idea at the very last stage, and we didn't do any research on possible theoretical implications. But that is absolutely fantastic. Thanks a lot. I mean, like, it will allow me to develop a bit further on that theoretical framework. Thank you, Claudia.
Yusra, would you like to comment?
Yeah, maybe sort of follow up on this and on your response to that, Marco. I mean, on Claudia's comment. It seems that I find it first really interesting how you're trying to make sense of this and theorize about it. But it seems that you started with this notion of repairing as reconnecting, kind of pairing, and then the other idea of returning sounds more like a potentiality, right? Or did people came back already, but came back to invest and inhabit that place? Or is it like, yeah, in the potentiality of it? And that's how I understand what you just said. But also on another note, or on a parallel note, what you bring in terms of ecology, in terms of interrelations of humans and non-humans, all sound to me or evoke to me this feminist, new materialist perspective, right? So, okay, so you probably know about it, but I don't know, yeah, what's your take on that, and how do you distinguish your?
Yeah, I mean, like, I'm not too familiar with that like set of ideas, but I'm trying to enter into that kind of field. So that's where the terminology comes from. Absolutely, I use it. I think I use it a bit in the paper. I didn't mention it in the presentation, but obviously, like, I'm trying to think with Donna Haraway idea of staying with the trouble, this idea of degrading ecologies, and the idea that you can develop responses that are different, so a responsibility that is different in relation. So it's absolutely from that kind of perspective, absolutely materialist kind of turning, which like we try to see the connections, because like the connections were not just from a theoretical perspective, but they were coming through directly from the interviews. I mean, like, they were never just talking about the hospital, they were talking about their territory a lot. I mean, like, and it was like consistently this insistence of our mountains, our beaches, our sea, our products, the products of our work. So I mean, like, I found that like really strongly emerging and matching that kind of a theoretical perspective. In terms of reparation and returning, I think it plays very in a complex way in terms of temporalities. So to some extent, there is like a going back, right? Like a going back to a past, but at the same time, it's going back to a past that never existed in a way. And so it affirms itself in a potentiality that is yet to come. And so it's beautiful, I think, like the way in which it connects a past that is sort of idealized, but that was not even good enough anyway, but it can be found in a completely different way with the affirmation of a creative alternative. I've been reflecting on this also in the ideas of recuperated factories, right? When you recuperate a factory, you sort of like, I think recuperating is a bit misleading, because like you don't want to recuperate the factory exactly as it was, because as it was like based on exploitation, based on a hierarchical kind of relation. So what you want is like recuperate something, but creating something new at the same time. So exploring potentialities of change. So it's like this dynamic between a past and a future that is interesting in this relation of reparation and return.
Great. Elena, you had a comment as well, and then Aviv.
Thank you. It was really fun, the presentation. Very interesting. The word that kept coming up in my mind was prefiguration. Okay, you talk a lot about resistance, but whenever you mention repair or return, I was like, oh, but it's in the future. It's enacting the new. So I don't know how, if you employ this kind of prefiguration within your research, but at least that's what's coming up in my mind throughout. Another comment is about politics of resistance in tension with prefigurative politics. So it's why we do the things we do, okay? We are spontaneous. Oh, let's occupy a hospital. Okay, but what is it really that we're trying to do with that? Is it the resistant subject there, or is it the prefigurative one, you know? And sometimes they are in conflict. It could be both there, happily, you know, together in harmony, but usually there is some tension there, and it's not always clear, you know, within these kind of initiatives. So just throwing it there as an idea, maybe, I don't know, in the interviews or how you process the content or what they told you about what they want to do, to my mind, it's quite important to differentiate the two or bring both of them together.
That's very interesting, because like George, my co-author, like he's the guy of prefiguration, is much stronger on that. My idea of resistance, like it's complete. I mean, like I understand like the tension you're trying to expose in terms of like what resistance represents in sort of in conflict or in a different kind of relation with the idea of prefiguration. But what I try to develop in the previous years, like, is a concept of resistance that sort of bridges the gap. I start like with a Foucauldian kind of understanding of resistance, and especially like there is a small interview in which he says that resistance comes first and comes before power, because it forces power to change, and in that sense is already affirmative. I try to develop that idea. Can I say I wrote a book? I published a book recently about that, so like a bit of self-publicity. I feel a bit ashamed, but so I try to develop this idea of resistance in which I think like that when we think about resistance, automatically we think of opposition. So something that tries to go against something. Now, what I think that the strategic effect of using resistance in that way is that it's very functional for power, in the sense that power stays there. There's just ways to be resisted. It's stable, it's monolithic, and in the same time, we don't appreciate the fact that it's actually much more vulnerable than what we can expect. And instead, resistance, I think, like in any kind of opposition, which happens to be there is some form of prefiguration. I mean, like, even if it's minimum, but there is some form of potential. Even when I talk to these people that were in the occupations, they all had sort of an idea of what they wanted to do next with the hospital. Some of them like wanted to operate it legally. Some of them wanted to operate it taking advantage of it, like so taking money from the state instead of private organization. Some of them wanted to run it in a completely anarchist perspective. Somehow they were all conflating within a horizon that was quite confused in terms of trajectory. Thank you. But I think like even if it was just at the level of potentialities and not sorts of expressed in a collective trajectory, which I think is much more prominent in other kind of organization like that, like the collectives you are analyzing, in which like is much clearer the prefiguration, the direction that you're taking. So what kind of horizon you want to explore in the present. I think in those sort of emerging kind of organization that do not have like the political history either, especially like we're talking of a really small town, a very small community. So politics, like it's very present for some, but for others are just happening to be there, if it makes sense. So I think like if you have a more nuanced understanding of resistance, we can sort of bridge the gap and explore the potentialities that this bridging the gap can mean. But I appreciate also that like differentiation would be important to understand how each component is active in that kind of aspect.
Great. Yusra, if you need to jump sessions, I wouldn't want to interrupt just now because there are a couple of more comments to be had, and Let's just, so I'm just letting you know, because it's fine, right? We can just go on for a few minutes further.
Yeah. The next session starts officially at 2:15, so I'll just
right.
go open it at 2 for anybody who would join in this 15-minute break.
Great.
Let's take a break also, or between sessions.
I think Magdalena had a comment to make. Oh, no, I think it was Aviv first, right? I'm skipping orders. Aviv, would you like to go first, and then we'll give?
Yes. Two things. One, when you're talking about this, how this kind of boundaries between resistance and prefiguration are never really, there's always like some prefiguration and a lot of resistance. I was wondering if you're looking at, maybe it's like an obvious suggestion at these instances of convergence centers when they were, you know, big counter summits, or also there's climate camps. There's a lot of this kind of activity of camping or creating a center that's usually like presented as something that's a form of resistance, say like the history of climate camps in the UK in the recent years, and before that, when they were doing counter summits against the G8 and World Bank and that kind of stuff, they would use to organize convergence centers for the activists, which were kind of camps. And they were, I think there's some people who looked at them as instances of because it was a self-organized. No border camps is another example, I think, of things that are kind of a visible act of resistance, but actually there was so much infrastructure and you know, so much self-organization that's prefigurative taking on in these just people creating a little city for a few days and organizing it into neighborhoods and kitchens and all these different things, disposing of trash, security, all this stuff. So that's like just something I thought of when you talked about this mix between resistance and prefiguration. And then what I was interested in hearing a little bit more is about this idea that I saw mentioned in your presentation about the occupied hospital as a public square. I saw that someone mentioned that and related to this idea of it being like an ecology, like you was talking before. But I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. What does it look like? How do you perceive it?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Like climate camps, like it can be one of the examples in which like you can use that. I think this concept. What I did, I developed this concept like mainly theoretically. So I think it can be adapted to reading a variety of different forms of resistance, but also forms of experiences. So I didn't go into like specifically scenarios of that kind, like climate camps, but I think it's absolutely like it can be like a way of looking at that, even though like there are potential differentiation, but like I think like keeping the concept open, it's a strategy for proliferation. So in the sense that like the more we keep the concept alive, the more we have like a possibility of avoiding what I really find like despairing is like that we always have the idea of defeat, right? Like we try to organize resistance and then we realize that we don't achieve much, and then like we throw away everything, and there is a lot of and I mean like it's part of the emotional aspect of it, like that Elena was talking about, like when you were talking disillusionment, burnout. What I try to do is like to hide all of this, which I don't think it's a very good strategy, but I think it's a way, even psychologically, we find some strength into an enthusiasm of something that can happen anyway, which I don't have personally. I'm much more inclined into disillusionment, but therefore writing the opposite of it could be sort of therapeutic. It didn't really work out in that way, but I mean, I think it was like an attempt. It was just like a gamble. Let's put it that way. What was your second point? Sorry, I forgot completely now that I started thinking about this.
About the public square. The hospital is a public square.
Yeah. I really like the idea that like there was obviously like with COVID and lockdown and restrictions, what we have like is massive isolation, solitude, everybody at home. That form of resistance specifically at that time sort of changed completely the perspective, because like he created a space in which it was sort of legitimate to aggregate and to find each other and to meet. And that's not just like in terms of these specific times, but also more generally in a town in which, as far as they described it to me, everything shut down. There are no bars, there are no restaurants, there are no places where to meet. So it recreated a space where they can actually go there every day. People of all sorts of age, all sorts of walks of life. So there is a basic number of people that are always in the occupation, which is like 4 or 5, and then there are like, they say like every day there are like at least 30 people that like hang around the occupation just because like it's good fun. And I mean like it is a bit trivial because it doesn't have like much of a political commitment or political construction, but I think it's political in the way that reactivates some form of community building that was completely gone for 11 years now. So I think like in that sense, it's sort of, we can call it pre-political, but like it's a starting point. It's somewhere like where you can build up like something for future kind of political development.
Great. Magdalena had to go from what I'm reading in the comments. She had a comment about language following to her earlier comment, and she thought that it would relate to all of the presentations. I'm inclined to agree, actually. But sadly, I think we're running out of time. We thank you for fabulous presentations and a lot of food for thought, and I'm lamenting the fact that we're not all in the same place now, and we could just continue talking over food and drinks, but c'est la vie. Hopefully we'll be able to all aggregate again. And again, thank you so much. The presentations will follow, and we'll have our closing session around 5 Central European time, right, Yusra?
Around 4.
Oh, right. That's 5 for me then. Right. Okay. Thank you so much for everyone. Thank you for the attendance in our lovely session. Sadly, there wasn't much time for longer interactions, but you never know what the future holds. Again,
Thank you for sharing, Chris. Thank you, everyone.
And thank you, everybody.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.